The Japanese delegation was standing only a few meters away. 11 men. The defeated empire behind them. A victorious fleet surrounding them. Then yet, for one brief moment on the deck of the USS Missouri, the most important ceremony of the 20th century was about to go wrong. The officers representing Japan had reached the surrender table in Tokyo Bay. The cameras were rolling. The world was watching, but they did not bow. No movement. No gesture of submission. Just silence. Around them stood American sailors who had fought through 4 years of war across the Pacific. Men who had watched ships disappear beneath waves of fire. Men who had survived islands where every hill, cave, and jungle path had become a battlefield. They knew exactly who stood in front of them. The question was not whether Japan had lost. Everyone knew that. The question was something far more dangerous. What happens when a war ends? But the hatred that created it is still alive. Because on September 2, 1945, the fighting had stopped. But peace had not yet begun. And on the deck of one battleship, a single decision would determine what kind of peace came next. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand what everyone aboard that ship believed was supposed to happen. For 4 years, the Pacific War had transformed into something beyond a conventional conflict. It had become a war where surrender itself seemed almost impossible. At places like Guadalcanal, American Marines fought through darkness and disease against Japanese forces that refused to retreat. At Toriwa, thousands of defenders chose death over capture. At Iwo Jima, the Japanese military turned an island of volcanic rock into a fortress built underground. 20-6,000 Americans became casualties fighting for a piece of land barely 8 miles wide. Then came Okinawa, the final major battle before Japan's surrender. Hundreds of thousands died when civilians were included. American commanders looking toward the invasion of the Japanese home islands expected something even worse. The planned invasion, code-named Operation Downfall, carried casualty estimates so high that the United States produced hundreds of thousands of Purple Heart medals in advance. The expectation was simple. If Japan had to be invaded, the Pacific War would end with one final catastrophe. That everything changed. 2 atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and attacked Japanese forces in Manchuria. And on August 15, Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people over the radio. For the first time in Japanese history, ordinary citizens heard the voice of their emperor. He did not use the word surrender. The language was carefully chosen, but the meaning was clear. Japan was ending the war. The fighting was over. Now came the far more uncertain challenge. How do you defeat an enemy without creating the conditions for the next war? That question was carried on to the deck of USS Missouri. Because surrender is not only a military event, it is a message. Every movement matters. Every symbol matters. The wrong gesture could turn defeat into humiliation, and humiliation could become the fuel for another generation of conflict. Douglas MacArthur understood this better than almost anyone. He was the man chosen to accept Japan's surrender and oversee the occupation that followed. He was also one of the most controversial commanders of the war. MacArthur had spent decades building a public image around himself. The sunglasses, the corncob pipe, the carefully staged photographs, the dramatic statements. He was a commander who understood the power of symbolism, and if there was anyone who had a personal reason to demand revenge from Japan, it was him. In 1942, he had been forced to leave the Philippines. Thousands of American and Filipino soldiers remained behind. Many would suffer during the Bataan death-marked years of captivity. MacArthur carried that defeat with him. A different commander might have designed a ceremony as a public punishment. A different commander might have demanded that Japan kneel before the world. But that is not what happened. The first surprise was the location. The USS Missouri, a battleship anchored inside Tokyo Bay. The message was obvious. America's Navy had reached the heart of Japan, but the deck itself was intentionally simple. No massive stage, no theatrical display, no weapons surrounding the ceremony. Just a table, a document, and the representatives of 2 nations that had spent years trying to destroy each other. MacArthur also made another unusual decision. The Japanese delegation would not be treated like prisoners. They would not be searched like criminals. They would not be stripped of every symbol of their former position. They would arrive as officials completing the final act of their government. It was a small distinction, but in that moment, small distinctions carried enormous weight, because the men approaching the table were not simply signing a document. They represented a country where some still wanted to continue fighting. Only days earlier, Japanese military officers had attempted a coup in Tokyo. Their goal was to stop the surrender. They tried to seize the recording of the emperor's announcement and prevent the Japanese people from hearing that the war was ending. The attempt failed, but it revealed something important. Japan was defeated. Yet the mindset that created the war had not completely disappeared. That was the danger waiting beneath the surface. The men who walked onto USS Missouri carried that tension with them. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu represented Japan's civilian government. He arrived with a wooden prosthetic leg after losing his limb in an earlier assassination attempt in Shanghai. Every step across the battleship deck was visible to the world. Behind him came General Yoshihiro Uemizu, representing the Japanese armed forces. Unlike Shigemitsu, Uemizu had opposed surrender. He had argued that Japan should continue fighting. He had believed signing such a document was impossible, but the Emperor had ordered him to appear. Now he stood on the deck of an enemy battleship, preparing to sign away the war he had spent years fighting. The stage was set. The defeated stood before the victorious. Thousands watched from the ship. Millions watched around the world. And then came the moment nobody had planned for. The Japanese officers reached the table. They paused. They did not bow. And suddenly, the future of the peace depended on what one American general would do next. The pause lasted only seconds, but everyone on the deck felt it. The Japanese delegation stood before the table without bowing. Around them were officers from every major Allied nation. Behind them stood sailors who had crossed the Pacific through years of convoy battles, kamikaze attacks, and burning seas. Many had buried friends. Some had survived ships that no longer existed. If anyone aboard had earned the right to demand submission, it was the men watching that morning. Instead, nothing happened. No shouted command. No public rebuke. No order to kneel. Douglas MacArthur simply stepped toward the microphones and began speaking, as though the hesitation had never existed. It was an extraordinary decision because it removed the confrontation before it could begin. The surrender was no longer about pride. It became about ending the war. That choice surprised even members of MacArthur's own staff. Many expected a speech reminding Japan of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and years of brutal fighting across the Pacific. Instead, they heard something entirely different. MacArthur spoke of peace. He spoke of building a world where disputes would no longer be settled by force. He spoke about responsibility rather than revenge. The tone immediately changed the atmosphere aboard the battleship. The Japanese delegation no longer stood as defeated enemies being publicly humiliated. They stood as representatives of a nation accepting military reality. That distinction mattered far more than anyone realized at the time, because humiliation has consequences long after applause ends. History had already demonstrated that. The First World War ended with ceremonies filled with triumph and punishment. The peace that followed left Germany defeated but also deeply embittered. Many Allied leaders in 1945 understood that another peace built upon humiliation could plant the seeds of another conflict. The ceremony aboard Missouri deliberately avoided repeating that mistake. There came another unexpected moment. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu approached the table. Every step demanded effort. Years earlier, an assassination attempt in Shanghai had cost him his right leg. His artificial limb made climbing the battleship's steep gangway exhausting. Now hundreds of cameras watched every movement. As he reached the table, he hesitated for only a moment, unsure how best to position himself before signing. The silence became uncomfortable. Everyone noticed. MacArthur did not, or more accurately, he chose not to. Rather than allowing the moment to become another public embarrassment, he quietly instructed an aide to assist the Japanese diplomat. No announcement. No spectacle, just practical help. The cameras recorded the signature instead of humiliation. It was a remarkably small act, yet it revealed exactly how MacArthur intended the occupation to begin. Strength had already been demonstrated. There was no need to demonstrate contempt. After Shigemitsu signed for the civilian government, General Yoshihiro Uemizu stepped forward. Unlike the diplomat beside him, Uemizu represented Japan's military leadership. Only weeks earlier he had argued against surrender. He believed Japan should continue fighting despite overwhelming odds. Now he stood before the document he never wanted to see. He signed quickly, stepped away, said nothing. Within moments MacArthur added his own signature, but even that carried another carefully considered decision. Instead of using a single ceremonial pen and keeping it as a personal souvenir, he switched pens several times during the signing. Each pen became a gift. One went to General Jonathan Wainwright. 3 years earlier, Wainwright had surrendered American forces in the Philippines after months of impossible resistance. He then endured years inside Japanese prison camps. Another pen went to General Arthur Percival. He had commanded British forces during the fall of Singapore and suffered the same captivity. MacArthur deliberately brought both men to Tokyo Bay. He wanted officers who had experienced America's darkest moments in the Pacific to witness its final victory. Not through revenge, through presence. It quietly completed a circle that had begun years earlier. Then the remaining Allied representatives signed one after another. The legal act took only minutes. The war that had consumed continents was officially over. But one final message remained. It did not come from the table. It came from the sky. As the ceremony ended, the distant sound of engines began rolling across Tokyo Bay. First dozens, then hundreds. Aircraft filled the horizon. Carrier fighters, Navy bombers, Army Air Forces B-minus 29 seconds. Wave after wave crossed directly above USS Missouri. More than 1,000 American aircraft participated in the carefully timed flyover. The symbolism was unmistakable. The ceremony had displayed restraint. The flyover displayed power. Together they formed a single message. America did not need humiliation to prove victory. Military supremacy already spoke for itself. No speech could equal the sight unfolding above Tokyo. The same industrial machine that had carried the war across the Pacific now demonstrated it could fill the sky whenever it wished. That was enough. The ceremony ended after roughly 20-3 minutes. The Japanese delegation departed. The documents were secured. The microphones were removed. Yet the most important chapter had only begun. Many Allied planners expected armed resistance during the occupation. Thousands of Japanese soldiers remained scattered across Asia and the Pacific. Some isolated units continued fighting for months. Others refused surrender entirely. Inside Japan itself, many feared underground resistance, sabotage, or prolonged insurgency. None of it emerged on the scale anticipated. Occupation forces entered cities that had been prepared for total war. Instead of widespread rebellion, they found exhaustion. Factories reopened. Schools resumed. Government ministries continued functioning under Allied supervision. The transformation was not